Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of PLP, Parent Like a Professional. Today we have Marky Helms and Monica Yanokida, both board certified behavior analysts. I'm Dr. Eric Meyer, and today we're going to talk a little bit about how we can set up the environment so that our children are more likely to listen to what we ask them to do in our everyday lives. All right. So, Monica, you have three children. Remind us, how old are they right now?
One is 10, 9, and 7.
10, 9, and 7. So you have two girls and a boy. I think the order is girl, boy, girl, right?
Correct.
Okay,
Yep.
great. So, tell us a little bit of some of the challenges you faced in the past, whether it's you, your husband Cameron, when asking your children to do something, or when you're telling them that something needs to be done, and they're not listening. So, how do you approach that? How do you deal with it? Share us some of the success stories and some of the challenges you've had with your three kids.
Well, talking about when they were really a lot younger, when they were kind of 1, 2, 3 age range,
Hmm.
I remember a couple of instances where, we try to ask them to do something simple, like let's clean up your toys, let's put all the balls back in the bin. Trying to be as specific as possible is always really helpful versus like clean up the room when they're that little. But I remember we used to have somebody come and help us at the home when my husband and I were both working outside. And she would always tell us that she was always having a hard time having them follow through because we would get home, we're like, why is it such a mess? And so she was like, well, I don't want to ask them to clean up or they weren't listening. So we always gave her the tip of just asking them to do one small part of the
Mm.
mess that they might have made, or trying to clean up obviously after they engage in each instance of play. But
Hmm.
just giving them a very specific task is really important when they're that young of age.
Mm. I
And what
like
about you?
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So instead of doing everything, you ask, or the coaching that you gave the person watching your children, just do a small part of it. And then she probably cleaned up the rest of it, or,
Yeah.
hopefully she did. And
Yeah.
then, it's an opportunity to provide a lot of praise, reinforcers, all that nice stuff. So
Yeah.
that's awesome. Yeah. I
And
was
then
thinking back. Go
mhm.
ahead.
Oh, and then making a game out of it, especially for my son who loved playing with balls or throwing and things like that. And I mean, all three of the kids, but I remember specifically him
Yeah.
making a game out of it is always fun because usually you have to put things back into a bin or a container when you're talking about
Hmm.
small toys.
Mm.
So making it a game and building in what we use as the reinforcers or the reward within the activity is always awesome if you can do that. So when he was throwing it in, being excited, like, yes, you did it. And he'd want to go and grab the next one to throw it in. Building that in to like make it a little bit more fun is always good to do.
Yeah, of course. Anytime you can make it like an enjoyable process, like that's the way to go, right? Parents with their children, you don't want to, place these demands and then they try to stay away from you. The idea is that if we can provide instructions or requests and we can make it, something preferred while we're doing it together, then, it's a great way to build positive relationships with your children. So I love that. I was thinking back when we were asking our children to clean up, and part of it is that you make the request, and sometimes they don't respond. A lot of people will say, and from what I've heard from other friends and their challenges, are that they'll ask a couple of times, and if they do it, it's the end of the day. They're too tired to deal with it, and so they just kind of, remove the request or demand, and they don't follow through.
Mhm.
And when they tell me these stories, then they'll ask me my opinion. And what I tell close family and friends is that when you ask your child or your children to do something and they don't follow through, it's important as a parent or the person making the request to follow through and make sure that they respond and respond to the request that's made so that in the future, when you make a request, they're going to follow through. And we talk about in the field of psychology or behavior analysis, we talk about how our words have control over behavior, and we call that stimulus control. And not to get too fancy using all this terminology, but if we're presenting an instruction and we don't follow through, then those words lose control over behavior. And then you find that every time you ask, there's a higher probability that the child or children are not going to respond. And so we don't want to get to that point where we end up saying our kids are not listening. And the truth of the matter is, our kids are listening. They're just not following through because there are no consequences. And when you ask your child to do something, make sure before you ask them to do something that you're ready to follow through. If you're too tired and it's the end of the day, it doesn't make you a bad parent. It just makes you a tired parent. And if you can't follow through, just don't make the request. You're better off just leaving the mess or cleaning it up yourself at a later time. But what we were doing with our little ones is that when we would make a request, if they didn't respond within about 3 to 5 seconds, we would, or at least initiate the response within 3 to 5 seconds. We would go over there and, physically prompt them to start cleaning up their toys so that in the future they understood, if you want to say, that when we make that request, they're going to have to follow through. But I love what you said earlier is making it very simple so that they're only cleaning up a couple of things. And then that way the task is easy. There's minimal response effort and you have a higher probability of success. So the most important thing again to get out of this is making sure that your words have some control, if not control over the behavior you're looking for, and how you lose that control or the words lose that control is by not following through.
Yeah, and just to add to that, it sometimes less is more in terms of what you're saying. A lot of times it's a habit of you give the instruction and now they're not listening, so you're trying to convince them. And so you're adding all this language of like, if you don't do it, then you're not going to make it to school. And I always joke with my parents, at a certain point, it's Charlie Brown, the adult, and it turns into want, and you've totally lost track of what the original instruction was. So to relate to what Dr. Meyer is emphasizing, if the instruction was clean up your toys, just keep it to clean up your toys.
That's a
Keep
good
the
point.
language there.
Right. So what happens if we're out in the community and you have young children? Because the idea is that if you start making your children follow through when you make a request or you place some sort of demand or instruction, then the idea is that as they get older, it makes it a lot easier and they're more likely to follow through. But what happens if you have young children and you're still in the process of trying to make them follow through when you ask them to do something and they don't when you're out in the community? So for starters, you have to make sure that you're doing this at home all the time. You just have to make sure that you want to make sure that they follow through if you ask them to do something, so that when you're out in the community, there's a higher probability that they'll follow through when you ask them to do something. I'm sure, Monica, with your children, you've been out in the community when they were younger, and you've had some challenges. Um, have you been to the grocery store with all three kids at one time where you've met with some challenges with them?
Oh yeah, definitely. Those are usually like also requests for things, which is a little different than
Sure.
asking to do something.
So they're
But
asking you for something basically, right?
yeah,
Yeah, tell
right,
us
right.
about that.
Well, if they're asking me for something at the grocery store, and if they don't, obviously sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. But I try to make it a rule, especially in the beginning, as like we don't want to get into the habit of always giving into all the requests.
Hmm.
But saying no and just like allow it, following through, I think is the biggest point, which is what you were talking about before, Dr. Meyer, with whether you're asking for them to do something or whether they're asking and you say no, you just want to stay with your with your response. If you said no, you don't want to just keep talking about it. Just no, and it's okay if they're going to have an emotional response, and that's okay. They might
Right,
cry, they might tantrum,
right.
but just following through, I think, is the overall idea, or to be consistent.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's hard it's hard to say no, uh, to your children. It's not easy, especially if they want something and you can't give it to them, and then they start to cry, and then there's probably this guilt that you feel as a parent because you don't want them crying, and then sometimes we give in, which is
Mhm.
probably not the best thing to do. Uh, with interacting with our children. We're not teaching them the right thing. I mean, you know, if the child's crying and you give in and you give them what they want, what are we teaching them at that moment?
That crying is going to get them what they want.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. So, parenting's not easy. It's especially when you're out in the community with young children. I always take my hat off to, young moms and dads that have young children, whether they're traveling, whether they're out in the community shopping for food, whatever it might be. It's like, it's always a challenge. And, I see sometimes when, there's a mom who has multiple children and some are crying. I always give the thumbs up and, a smile like, hey, you're doing a great job. Like it's not easy. But I prefer to see families that allow their children to cry, because sometimes they're doing the right thing, than to just give in because they're embarrassed of what other people might think. And, I tell, parents all the time, don't worry about what other people are thinking. You just know you're a good parent. You're doing the best that you can. It's not easy. And there is no perfect parent, not even on this panel, not
Mhm.
anywhere. So
Right.
just keep that in mind when you're dealing with your children.
Yeah.
You took the words right out of my mouth. Yeah.
And learning sometimes can be a little bit painful. So it's okay
Oh
if
yeah.
they're crying and that's part of the learning process. So
Right.
they
Right.
aren't ever having, a tantrum or something, then, there's probably something going wrong anyway.
Right. Yeah. Work hard now and life will be easier later. I tell
Yeah.
people that all the time.
Yeah. And starting small, I think, and understanding that sometimes you might have had a bad day. That doesn't mean it's an ongoing issue. I always think too, some people are like, oh my gosh, my kid never, or they're always, and it's usually not the case. But when you do have a behavior challenge you're working through, it's always best to start small and start at the house if you can, and then
Hmm.
branch out.
And you made a good point. Like, my wife was telling me something a while back. She's like, just because you have a bad experience doesn't make it a bad hour. Just because you have a bad hour doesn't make it a bad day. Just because you have a bad day doesn't mean that you have a bad life. We have to put things in perspective. I mean, that's just part of life, right? Life, when you're dealing with children, is like riding a roller coaster. You have your ups and your downs, but the journey itself is something that you need to enjoy, and you have to remember that. So it's not all ups, and hopefully it's not all downs, but it's learning how to ride that roller coaster as a parent. And again, like we said earlier, there are no perfect parents. Don't ever feel that if you're having challenges out in the community that it makes you a bad parent. It makes you an amazing parent for dealing with it and, for being a positive role model for your children in their lives.
Another important topic to include in this conversation is when we do follow through with our kiddos, is to add that reinforcement or reward at the end of when they are successful. And that could take many different forms and kinds of reinforcement, depending on how old your kiddo is and all that stuff. But I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that and making sure we provide the reinforcement, and also not, and once they are really successful at that one individual task that we've asked them to do, then to start thinning that schedule. What's what we call the schedule of reinforcement. So you're not having to reinforce every time. So I don't know if we want to kind of go into that or give some examples.
Yeah, I think that's great, Monica. I mean, it's really important to make sure that, if, for example, a child starts to follow through the first time you ask them to do something, one thing you could do is jump in and help them and allow them to, be free of cleaning everything up once they're at the point where they're required to clean everything up. The thing that I think is if you're providing social praise to your children and smiles and just excited to be around them, I think that alone can function to increase the behaviors that you're looking for. But little prizes, little you might have a point system for your child or children in the home setting, but as long as there's something to show your child that you're proud of them, that you're happy that they did the right thing, and that's what we call a reward. But if it changes behavior, and it changes and strengthens the behavior that you're looking for, we call it reinforcement. So, the idea is to find things that are preferred if they, like the praise and you can see the reaction on their face. And if they love, accumulating points, you might have, again, a point system in place. But it is important to make sure that you follow through as a parent with some sort of, consequence that will function to reinforce their behaviors.
And including that social reinforcement, I think is so important, especially when they're young. They're really looking for you to, to engage with them. And I mean, that continues on for the rest for their whole life, hopefully, if you've, if
Right.
they're
And
looking.
they want to feel acknowledged, right? They want to
Yeah.
feel that, you're acknowledging that they did the right thing. Yes, for sure. And you can see that when they're looking, they're giving eye contact, they're looking for the smile. I mean, all of those things are important parts of being, a good parent, right? Is making sure you show that that you can acknowledge that your children are going down the right path.
Yeah. And I think that sometimes people think, oh, reinforcement of the reward has to be something like tangible. But it
Right.
really, so much of it just is social praise and parent interaction and acknowledging that they're doing the right thing, even as they get older, because I think as a parents, we sometimes fall into the expectation. We expect them to do this. We expect them to be this certain way. But as my kids are kind of in this elementary school age, once in a while, I'm just trying to really, even though they're expected to keep their room clean or make their bed, just sometimes giving that social interaction and praise and telling them that they're doing a great job, or I like the way, how you keep your room or things like that, I think goes a long way too. So
Definitely.
including that is really important.
Very good.
Well, thank you, Dr. Meyer. Thank you, Monica, for such wonderful input today. Hopefully, this is kind of helpful for all the parents that are watching out there. If you have additional questions, submit them our way. You can submit them on YouTube. You can submit them on the website, and we would be happy to answer them in another episode. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Take care. Hope to see you guys soon.